confess that my heart is beating like crazy. I feel extremely honoured to be invited to speak today. And it is a contentious subject. I am a contentious person, but it really is coming from the heart. And I need to say from the outset that there may well be things that I say and suggest today which contradict your thinking and your experience and your belief, or even your programs if you've written them. But obviously nothing is personal. This is really a wonderful platform for food for thought and a discussion piece. And I kind of work internationally, so I keep an eye on what's going on with regard to the reading debate and how we teach reading across the world, because as you know, English is the language that many countries choose to teach children as a new or an additional language. And so I'm very mindful and very respectful of research, but I'll be very clear when I feel that something is research informed and which basically it's more experience informed. And today it really is going to be more about experience informed, and therefore I suppose I'm talking about my opinion. My opinion is based on my experience and my provision of teaching, special needs teaching, being a head teacher at one time, working in a huge range of different types of primary schools and early years settings. And so really, I quite enjoy saying to people now, I'm getting on a bit as well. So I've had many decades of all this type of experience. And as you might know, it also dips into writing material for people through phonics programs and delivering teacher training and consultancy. Now, the most powerful point of that is when you are a consultant and you get into schools, you can theorize about what you're going to see, and then you see it. And you see practices of provision, and you can see often very quickly what's missing, where the weight of the teaching or the balance is wrong, and so on. But I've always worked through the internet. And because of that, I have heard from people all over the world with many different roles and responsibilities, whether it's a parent or a tutor or a school or teaching English as a main or additional language in many, many contexts. And I've been helping and advising people. So although I can't always quote research, there are plenty of anecdotes to say that what I'm saying makes a lot of sense to people. And I'm really grateful that Janet's mentioned the notion of alphabetic code overview charts, because I really feel that's one of the most practical tools we have. It equates to having an alphabet poster or a times table poster or a periodic table. It's just saying this is the code that we are teaching you. Now, amongst all the people that I hear from, it is often teachers and parents of children who are Key Stage 2. So in Scotland's scenario, that will be P3 onwards, but not only that, also in secondary. And my opinion is that all teachers and teaching assistants should be trained in an understanding of the very complex English alphabetic code, which is the most complex alphabetic code in the world. They should have an understanding of how we are teaching reading from the beginning and how we can help and remediate children. But they also need to understand how this fits in with spelling. Now, we've had fantastic developments in England, as you may know. So I came into this picture before the National Literacy Strategy, when as a primary teacher going to many different schools, I saw so many children struggling with reading, writing and spelling in the junior age range, and their behaviour changed when they were asked to do those things. And I was totally ill-equipped to know what to do about it, but I knew there was something not quite right. I didn't believe those children couldn't be taught to read, write and spell. So I developed a specific interest into that, and I got myself an infant teaching job, and that began my journey of learning about phonics. And when they brought out the National Literacy Strategy in England's context, way back in 1998, and I was getting the training, it was rather enforced, although not statutory. Everyone had to have their training, and there were many materials sent out to schools to support that. It didn't make sense to me, and it didn't make sense to my experience. I didn't know about research findings at that time. I'd had no teacher training, but my experience and beginning to learn about phonics through, first and foremost, the Jolly Phonics Handbook, which was, many of us, it was our only experience of phonics at that time, that it made a profound difference to the children when they were taught phonics explicitly. And then, of course, at that time, there weren't decodable reading books. So we had to fight a corner to have decodable reading material. However, the focus tends to be on reading, reading, reading. And in England's context, we have a statutory end of year 1 phonics screening check to see how children are doing nationally. It's a snapshot. But because phonics is one of those things that people are phobic about it, and they're phobic about it because they don't understand it. They don't understand how we can teach it. They don't understand the complexities of the English alphabetic code. Therefore, they feel threatened, and it maybe contradicts what they've done all along. But actually, it's incredibly exciting to have teachers supported and trained how to teach that complex code systematically, not just for reading, but for spelling. And I'm going to talk about spelling quite a bit. Now, people like myself with different phonics experiences and programs challenge the National Literacy Strategy multi-queuing searchlights. Now, this may seem historic in England's context, but it's not a historic issue in the rest of the UK. And it's not a historic issue in countries like America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. This is still hot stuff as to how best to teach children and how to train teachers. So I'm sort of dipping into different eras, if you like. But on these challenges, we were very lucky because we had a parliamentary inquiry in England's context. This was championed by Minister Nick Gibb, who is still the Minister of School Standards to this day. And he did this as a cross-party thing, and we got major changes. And what was so powerful was Sir Jim Rose's independent review held back in 2005, 2006. And although his report is archived, or it's under the archive label in England, it's actually a world-renowned report. And what made it so important was because he didn't just rely on the research at that time, of which there was plenty. He allowed what he and his team of inspectors could see with their own 2 eyes in practice. So he gave credit to practice and, if you like, common sense, what he could see, what they found when children could read. And I think that's really important. And to this day, we do not always have a balance of the importance of research findings informing practice, but the importance of practice maybe informing research and moving on from there. So I'm very clear that I'm not an academic. I'm very clear that I'm a practitioner, and that actually we've got some pretty leading edge developments in England's context. So following the Rose Report, people in England will know that we then had a government publication called Letters and Sounds, which was promoted as a high quality phonics programme. And it was aimed really for the early years, and particularly year 1 going on into year 2. And it made a huge difference. It actually brought the notion of systematic synthetic phonics to the table to practice in England's schools. And we've had a long journey since then. And when Nick Gibb introduced the phonics check way back in 2012, it made teachers more mindful of their phonics provision. So that began to improve. And so this national snapshot of children's decoding ability rose and rose and rose, and then it stalled at 82%. So prior to the lockdown and the pandemic, for about 4 years, it was around a national average of 82% of children reaching or exceeding the benchmark. Now, it could be that the remaining 18% were nearly there or not. But generally speaking, you're still talking about 6 children out of 30 not getting there. And should they be able to get there or not? But when they were starting to look at schools who were achieving in the 90% of children reaching or exceeding that benchmark, there were well over 1,000 schools doing it, and some schools doing it consistently. even in more challenging circumstances, and year on year, despite cohorts. So although your cohort does make a difference, absolutely it does. And your figures and statistics might change if you're in a smaller school compared to a larger school. Nevertheless, we have a stalling situation. So what about that 18%? But what about spelling? And so there is no equivalent national snapshot for spelling that is just based on phonics rather than the morphemic element, because I'm going to talk about morphology and etymology too, and what that might look like in the infants and going up to Key Stage 2 and even in Key Stage 3. So let's go back to Sir Jim Rose's report. There were 4 bullet points in there that were absolutely fantastic, and they're relevant to this day. And the 4 bullet points were that we need to teach the English alphabetic code systematically and explicitly. And when we talk about synthetic phonics, it equates to mainly at phoneme level. So we're not talking about teaching phonics in chunks. We're talking about at the smallest sound level. And then it was the next 2 bullet points to read, to decode by sounding out and blending. And that's where we get the word synthesizing. And then the next bullet point was to be able to orally segment and allot those letters and letter groups, which is the spelling process. And the 4th bullet point was, and to know that the alphabetic code is reversible. And that's it. So hang on a minute, we're focusing on reading at the expense of spelling. And when I go into schools to do observations, which was prior to lockdown, of course, but I know that Abby's still currently going into schools and working with schools closely, and I work with schools through the internet and different connections, I can tell you that we have an imbalance in teachers' translation of what they do in the classroom to teach the children. And we need to understand what's going on and to move on from there. And in doing that, if the infants haven't really all refined their practice and enabled 30 children in a class to get to those high levels, you've then got a knock-on effect into Key Stage 2. But because in letters and sounds, it was really suggesting that the job is more or less done of teaching that alphabetic code by the end of year 1, which would equate to the complex code at phase 5. And then there was a phase 6, which is focusing on a few secure phonics spelling rules, and also bringing in the grammar element. There is a perception that with phases that you've completed the code and then you move on, and any children who haven't grasped that code well enough must be intervention. It's about a within child issue, and it might be affected by children's learning capacity. But from what Abby and I are seeing, and many others who are going into schools and auditing, it's not really just about the children and their learning difficulties. It is still at the point of the teaching provision. And I am going to suggest, and this is my opinion, based on my experience, that we need to move on from the idea that you just need your 20 minutes a day to do your little bit of phonics and do it in this way, and then it's job done, because it's not job done. We've got the 18%. But also, if teachers are exceeding to get that 82% to reach or exceed that benchmark, we also have to consider, but can we do better still? So if teachers get defensive and say, well, we're doing what we should, we're working very hard, we're phonicking the children to death, as professionals, we must always think, but can we do better still? And are we really extending the bright, precocious children? What does our phonics look like for them? And I can also tell you that very often when you go to a typical phonics lesson, the adult, which can be a teacher or a teaching assistant, it's not just the domain of teachers, is invariably working very hard, giving the formula of phonics lesson. But you look at the children, they're not practicing very much. For a start, there isn't much time left in that 20 minutes. And also, the formula that's become what we do in England is not necessarily content rich. And it's not necessarily a good balance between whether the dominant practice is a reading, print to sound activity, or a spelling, sound to print activity, building in plenty of quality teaching of handwriting. And so, although in this field we tend to think of balanced literacy as a bad thing, as in linking to whole language, when it comes to phonics, we need to know these understandings about balance. But also the idea that when you get to year 2 or even year 3, phonics should be job done, but not for these special needs children. We have to change that perception and go back to our practice to look at it to see if we can improve it. Another thing that happened in England was the Department for Education introducing this notion of being able to scrutinise bodies of work, that is the phonics programmes, to be able to see if they fulfil the core criteria. And the core criteria goes back to Jim Rose's bullet points, the 4 bullet points, but it also expands on it a little bit to talk about introducing high frequency words, that these are drip fed into a phonics program as far as possible in a cumulative decodable way, and don't start off as an initial sight vocabulary. So it's a real shift in practice from, if you like, historic phonics, where you might try to teach children words as whole global shapes at first and then introduce the phonics. So England's version of systematic synthetic phonics is not ignoring those words, but it looks at the phonic element that works regularly. It looks at the unusual part, and it's not trying to teach the word as a shape. And it's got children thinking phonically anyway. And that's an important aspect of our phonics. But this perception that it's job done really needs to change, in my opinion. Now, when I do my big teacher training, I give pretty early on in the training a great deal of importance to talk about the perception of phonics being just the domain of the infant teaching, practical way of teaching children, to really understanding that phonics is our lifelong, subconscious, if you like, reading and spelling skill when required. And I take people through an exercise for spelling and for reading to demonstrate that they themselves are using phonics and they don't even realize it. Very often it's a chunking level. So by the time we're literate people, we can think in terms of chunks and spelling strings, but nevertheless, it's a form of phonics. So I use a real word, but it's a couple of words that people won't have come across or rarely, to make them have to decode it and look at it. And I'm saying, well, how did you do it? They have to analyze what it is they're doing. And equally, I give them a spoken word that they won't have come across before. And I say, I don't want the spelling. There isn't a correct spelling, but I want you to think, what did you do to spell that word? And then with regard to the spelling, they allot letters and letter groups. And I'm saying, well, why don't you spell the ch sound at the beginning with TCH? And then they realize they understand that we don't have that spelling pattern in the English code. So what I'm trying to do is really demonstrate that phonics is their adult stuff. And even when touch typing, for example, if you're doing a longer word you don't normally type, think to yourself, what do you do in your head? Do you kind of sound it out, or do you do letter names? What it is you do. And then also I point out that very often the people who are in the teaching profession are the ones who picked it up probably through a book by book experience in their childhood, building up their recognition of words, maybe deducing the alphabetic code for themselves subconsciously, and therefore they don't understand what it's like to be little and to have to learn to read and write. And I'm old enough to go back to the days when spelling in the infants and the preschool was the magic line approach. So as children picked up bits of letters and sounds, they would write with the odd letter and put a line when they didn't know how to spell it. And we've moved on massively since then by teaching children to spell explicitly right from little. This is huge. And it's also huge that what we're doing is promoting all through the word phonics, not just first sound, last sound, middle sound. We're going all through the word for reading, and all through the spoken word to identify the sounds with oral segmenting for spelling and allotting the letters and letter groups. Now, what's also happened is when the core criteria was brought in for validation, and there were a handful of programs that were validated and named by the government in that process, And something similar is now going on in other countries. So in Australia, Spelled Organization, various bloggers will name programs that sort of are good quality programs. The phonics programs that were validated are very different. They are not the same. They have different approaches. The authors of those programs have a different rationale. So I need to say, this is what they have in common. And you need to find out with your interests what they have that is not the same. And I think it's wonderful that schools have choices. I think it's important that people understand these differences and choices and how we can build on that for Key Stage 2. Now, one of the differences, some of those phonics programs are designed only for littlies, to kind of fit around letters and sounds notion that you might start systematically in reception and then end of year 1, more or less job done, bit of tidying up in year 2, done, park the phonics. Other phonics programs are saying, well, no, we build on with richer vocabulary that's more suitable or perfectly suitable for Key Stage 2, occasionally Key Stage 3 if required. And it's become a spelling program. And in becoming a spelling program, it is still addressing reading because you're still practicing that sounding out and blending. So you need to know your program. And I am a key person to explain the differences here, because, for example, the program that I did with Oxford University Press, Floppy's Phonics, is aimed at reception in year 1 and year 2 as required. It depends how fast you go or when you start it, but it's designed for infants. But it's got a very comprehensive code coverage. The mother of Floppy's Phonics, where I grew my knowledge and understanding, was the Phonics International program. And the Phonics International program can be used very happily to contribute to spelling going into Key Stage 2, because the later units of work include the kind of vocabulary and the resources that are going to support spelling and building up knowledge of spelling word banks. So both programs cover about the same amount of code, but they are designed differently. And some schools, for example, will choose to use Floppies in infants and then go on to use Phonics International after a baseline as required in Key Stage 2 to further build on their spelling and for intervention purposes. There are other phonics programs where the author is saying, this is about teaching reading. So although you will find blending and segmenting in those early stages, it's about, we do all this phonics, we do it rigorously, and then the children are readers and we don't need to go on majoring on it. And then they've written a separate spelling program. And then there's other programs where they come at it from a really a rather pedantic approach, that they're going from sound to print, that you teach reading through children speaking, you start like this and you do this and you do these things. And it will work, and that's fine. And it's important that we keep at least a national snapshot on these results. But we mustn't think all of these programs are the same. They have nuances, and it does. Some of them literally provide resources going on to Key Stage 2. Now, in the world of people who like to do Twitter and social networking and the Doodle network, we have got some buzzwords that are increasingly coming into play. And I'm going to mention those now. And I've got a huge confession to make. So I've always had my way of pronouncing one of these in particularly. And I'm thinking, oh, crikey, what if I'm pronouncing it generally incorrectly? I better check. So I hot-footed it to Google this morning to do a pronunciation. And that's etymology. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, etymology. Because sometimes it's right, okay. And I don't have a Latin language background. So people in Key Stage 2 start to talk about morphology and they talk about etymology as if you've moved on from phonics and do those things there. And now I'm going to say, this is where my opinion comes into it. Because phonics doesn't stop. It needs to become, in my view, the undercurrent of where you are teaching and supporting our young learners as a continuum, both for reading and spelling as required. And that could be just in that wider curriculum. But also, just as I worried with letters and sounds, that after phase 5, it went to phase 6 to talk about some spelling rules that are pretty solid, and grammar, I felt that was always wrong. And I would say, well, when do we start to drip in grammar? And the bits of grammar you're dripping in, and even those spelling rules that are consistent, aren't after you have covered the whole of that complex code. They are along with, from reception, because we are using wider language. And I mean, I've actually built it into my phonics programs because they include a whole range of cumulative decodable plain texts, not reading books, the rich languages within the actual programs. And so we're not devoid of grammar, and we're not devoid of some solid spelling rules at a very early stage. It's not you do this, then you do this, not at all. It's these things are running alongside. And it's the same with morphology. Now, morphology is looking at the structure of words and where things like prefixes and suffixes are related to meaning making. So we have singular and plural words, we've got verb endings and all of those aspects of our language and of our spelling, which come into play from the beginning. So when you're teaching your phonics program, either the phonics program will be drip feeding that in, but in any event, your wider work will be drip feeding those things in. And it may well be that you don't have a formal grammar plan until about year 2, but by the time you reach year 2 and you've introduced all that code, we've been using spoken language and written language and rich literature and all of those things all of the time. These are parallel things, not one or the other or a progression. And in the same way, when you maybe major more on morphology and get into etymology, the phonics doesn't stop, the phonics continues. But we need to have changed the perception of phonics from, oh, it's baby stuff, it's infant stuff, it's just about teaching little children, to actually, it's a lifelong knowledge and skill that we need. And some children need it more and with more support and more teaching and longer for themselves and their learning issues. But in any event, I don't think we've got the initial teaching sorted out yet. I think we have a long way to go, at least in some schools, perhaps many schools, because we need to build on and move on from where we are and recognize these things in common in the infants that people are struggling with, because the adults are teaching their hearts out. It's not a criticism of a lack of effort. It's that we need to look at what's missing. We need to look at what's a mess in the infant classroom. And some of you who have already followed Anne Glennie and Abby Steele and me know we're already challenging things like teaching our little infant children a form of single letter print with a lead-on join. No, this has gone from trend to fad. And I need to be challenging. We need to be challenging and contentious. Bring in your arguments. And so recently we did a whole webinar on that that's pre-recorded, because this is going to cause at least some children difficulties and muddlement, and it's passing the intricacies of joint writing to our little children unnecessarily. It's passing the buck down to those little children. So as a country, as a world, we have all of these things, these minutiae things, these sweat the small stuff things to consider. So in terms of moving forwards with spelling, the notion that now we've done phonics, we need morphology and etymology. No, bring in those things. Morphology is at a very early stage from the outset, drip fed in with explanation. When you get to verbs, you get into word classes, regular verbs, irregular verbs. A good phonics body of grammar body of work will help you with that, because we need to go to think about quality control. When you're an author of programs, you have to work to the teachers and teaching assistants that haven't had the training, the background, the Latin background, whatever, and we need to support them by handing it to them on a plate, so that at least they are guided and supported to a certain standard, and then they can bring in their own knowledge and understanding. But when it comes to etymology, this is a different one, because I think it's important on an intellectual level. It's further examination of words. It's looking at the history of words, which is fascinating on an intellectual level. It overlaps with morphology. And as children get older, they are entitled to know about that. But listen, folks, we're also dealing with a language that's got hundreds and thousands of words. So it's not about an obsessive look at those aspects. It's about a selection of which words shall we look at. Do we have a program that helps us with that? Because we might not know about it ourselves. Have we supported teachers well enough? It could probably be going into the realms of actual subject areas. So if you're teaching history or geography or science, the vocabulary that's associated with those subjects, you might think, okay, we're introducing that vocabulary, but let's do a little bit around that, or do it in that cross-curricular way with our literacy. But to think that you've moved on from phonics, I say, is fundamentally wrong. And to think that you have to say, oh, we've part of phonics now it's morphology and etymology. Now on Twitter, this is what I'm seeing, that a few years ago, names cropped up, sometimes people with authority in their countries or their schools, and they were concerned because they weren't doing the systematic, explicit, synthetic phonics. And they got onto that and they did their research and they looked into the research and the programs and they introduced it into their schools, into their authorities and so on. And now they think they've cracked that. So the latest buzzwords have become, now we go on to morphology, we need morphology and we need etymology. Yes, to an extent, but it's not a one or the other. It's what do our children need? What will benefit from them, both in terms of their technical capacity to read and spell and to love language and to enjoy it, and then how to support them without it being something where their self-esteem is threatened. My approach, for example, is from the outset of those little children, we tell them this is a really complex code. Janet mentioned, this is my little tabletop chart. This is ready-made, but I do free ones to say, this is what we're teaching you, and we're going to need to teach and support you for a long time, but I'm going to help you with that. We have to shift children's difficulties and those children that don't keep up with their peers so much and attribute it to this complex code, not them. So training and ethos is really wrapped up in that whole self-esteem issue, and we need to make it be adult. And this is why I'm saying, don't be afraid of that code, and the training is about the language. Let me help you with that and let me support you with that. And in doing that, it's a tricky thing to put across. So on my Phonics International site, I've got just printable posters like this. So I'm taking a word with a very unusual bit of spelling in here, but with this very simple approach. In this word, these letters are code for this sound and provide the sound. You can go on to say there's hardly any words that are spelt that way, and this is a root word for that. And then when it comes to spelling, and this needs to be all of the time as the underpinning of your work, whether Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3, it's let me help you to spell that tricky, unusual, or interesting word when you see children spelling incorrectly. Now, when I was in teaching, it was during an era when enormous pressure started to be placed on schools, and when governments and regional advisors, maybe some of you or you're the next generation of advisors saying, this is what you need to do, pressure on, pressure on. And I think that is the case to this day. But we need to be collective, advisors and schools. We need to really understand how we can move on, how we can get better. So it's let me help you with that. And sometimes I find Ofsted to be a friend. So people at the very top are very wonderful people trying to move things along. But the notion of inspection and judgment and it killing reputations is not good. So sometimes I'm a supporter of Ofsted, sometimes I'm a big critic of Ofsted, sometimes I'm a supporter of what the government does, sometimes I'm a big critic of what the government does. But I can do this fearlessly, and this is what I constantly encourage people who know me Be fearless, but be professional in what you suggest, what you notice, what you comment. And we need equality in the teaching profession. In this modern Zoom era, we can have that. It shouldn't just be advisors or politicians or whatever. We really need to bring all of our knowledge and understanding together to improve this. So when it comes to spelling, very often children should move up from the infants, able to orally segment a word. If it's a multi-syllable word, their first step is to identify the syllable chunks and then maybe take each chunk to be able to orally segment, or maybe by that stage, they have learned a letter string like T-I-O-N or C-I-A-N and that type of thing, because a good phonics program should be able to introduce those things. So we're still doing that phonic breakdown. When it comes to things like verb endings, that can and perhaps should be in a phonics program, but you can talk about morphology as well as required for reading, for spelling. But then if you can reference that to alphabetic code charts, which my suggestion is that the sounds are always down the columns because they come to an end point, but the spelling alternatives are many. And there are more than on this chart. This is a comprehensive selection, but you'll find lots of words with very unusual spellings like leopard, which you can then analyze and make a quick poster or something like that. Also, no phonics program can give you every word you need in your curriculum. And so some are very comprehensive with things like common or high frequency words stripped into the program. But every teacher in the land needs a tray of paper, perhaps with a sheet chopped into A5, a pack of felt pens. And when an interesting or unusual word comes up, write it out plainly and then put it on your spelling and phonics wall next to your main alphabetic code chart. Because what we're saying is you've identified the right sound, but in that word, we need this spelling as in, and then you can reference it on your chart. Now, if you don't organize our complex English alphabetic code chart in an organized way, and bear in mind, human beings like to have organization and they can often understand things better when it's organized. Imagine what phonics looks like to a child or a teacher without something organized, where you're heading your overview. It's day after day, week after week, introducing another letter sound correspondence, another letter sound correspondence, pronunciation variations or alternatives, spelling variations and alternatives, and you're just little, or you're struggling in Key Stage 2, or you've reached Key Stage 3 and your reading and spelling is inaccurate, but the staff don't know how to support you in that. So to summarize, phonics is adult stuff. And when I ask the staff, when I'm doing any training at all, and I do my bit on demonstrating that they're using phonics, even if subconsciously, with a rare person who suddenly realizes they don't, that they've learned word by word, or they don't think in terms of their phonics, a rare person, then we're actually saying, what do you, the adults, think that your Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 children, that's sort of junior and secondary, when they get maybe a phonics intervention, do they think that they're getting phonics adult stuff of the most complex alphabetic code in the world? Or do they think they're getting phonics baby stuff? And what do you think the answer is? And I have trained thousands of people in hundreds of schools. It's baby stuff. The perception is baby stuff. But even some of the most clever, knowledgeable, systematic synthetic phonics proponents think of it as baby stuff, job done in the early stage, because we get children reading so quickly with good phonics provision. And some children, many children, will absolutely self-teach. We might have self-taught. I wasn't aware of phonics as a child. It was a book-by-book approach. Many of you will have learned to read, perhaps at mother's knee, book by book. But we have changed how we're teaching now. And we can get better still in England. We can make it look different and feel different in Key Stage 2. Yes, we can be mindful of morphology and etymology, but we need some support with that. If you go on the internet and look in the search engines, there are amazing sites nowadays that give you the breakdown of words you might want to know. So, for example, if you're doing a history topic in Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3, pick out the words that you think are of interest, go onto Google, be supported by the word inquiry there, and then at the moment you can decide therefore what to do. But it's not an either or, it's a big picture approach to loving our language. And when you have pressurized teachers with all of those subjects to do, and then all of those social and emotional issues, and the health issues, and the arty stuff, and the physical activity, can we really take hundreds of words and do the etymology and the sound word inquiry and so on? Absolutely not. There aren't the hours in a day, and there are hundreds and thousands of words that we need to do. And I suggest that we have a whole group of children who are word skippers come Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. They don't necessarily come up with a silent pronunciation in their head of words they don't know, printed words they don't recognize, printed words that they don't know in their spoken language. They can deduce what they mean, but without a pronunciation, they cannot grow their spoken language. So when you think children are free readers or you're better readers, you still need to have them reading aloud to you and to keep an eye on that. And in my day as a teacher, we were trained not to mark for spelling. What is your main learning intention? Don't spoil children's creativity by looking at their spelling. Spelling supervision, spelling teaching, spelling support was demonized. And so really, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying we can have a little culture of quietly and supporting, helping children. When you do supervise their work or you're looking at their work, any words which keep flagging up are spelled incorrectly. And sometimes it's as simple as went, when children might start spelling it W-H-E-N-T or with W-H-I-T-H. That's not uncommon. If you see it in your class, go and write out that poster, stick it on your spelling board, and in future, you just have to tap on the page where you see that those words spelt incorrectly, point to the board and don't accept it. Don't let it set in. And also, that's an issue about invented spelling. Phonics often gets a bad name because Key Stage 2 and even Key Stage 3 people are inheriting children who can express themselves very well, thank you very much. The phonics has enabled them to spell, but they're spelling phonetically or phonically plausibly, and teachers aren't trained and equipped to know how to address that. So if you've got a child who's got a page or two sides of fantastic content, but riddled with phonically plausible spellings, what do you do about it? And if you go through the whole of a reception class at the simple code level, which is all of the sounds and mainly one spelling, which enables creative or inventive spelling, and you don't have a culture of how hard the code is, and let me help you with that, and let's look at these spellings incidentally. So it's two-pronged phonics. It's your systematic phonics and your incidental provision, because if you're sharing the Billy Goat's Gruff story, you don't want children to think it's B-R-I-J. You might need to bring in a bit of code, drip feeding it in, or looking at your alphabetic code chart from a very early stage to sow the idea that teachers need to help and support the children all the time so that children don't feel attacked if they get something wrong. It's not about them, it's about the code. And teachers don't fear, they're not fearful of helping children with the spelling because they don't want to spoil the self-esteem of the children. And then in phonics as well, we have an absolute mini whiteboard culture, which I don't think is doing anything any good at all for those basic skills. It's fine for a bit of quick fire show me. It's fine at the beginning for doing some activities with things like magnetic letters or graphing tile manipulation, that type of thing. But then after that, Isn't it convenient that anything the children do in their phonics session gets all wiped off and there's nothing to pass on for special needs, no picking up on letter formation, no showing senior management what's gone on, no sense of achievement of the children other than superficial, nothing in the books to show parents and home. You know, this mini whiteboard culture could look very different. And I think we need the conversations around that with regard to all of the minutiae of the basic skills. How do we move forward with phonics and morphology and etymology as we do those basic skills whilst enriching children's vocabulary? How do we present intervention? Now, this is shocking now. The Education Endowment Foundation, I've had an argument with them for years because on their page describing phonics, they are stating and implying that if a child is sort of in the sort of upper key stage 2 area, you know, 10 years old, and they're not reading well yet, then phonics hasn't suited them and they need something else. Well, what something else do they come up with? Metacognition and self-regulation strategies. Like, what the? You know, that is nonsense. So Jim Rose cracked it in his report back in 2006. It is the same alphabetic code and phonics skills that all learners need, regardless of their individuality. And if they haven't got it in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, they need it. Obviously not with programs designed for infants. And they need the perception that phonics is lifelong adult stuff of the most complex alphabetic code in the world. And what does that look like? And we need to have those discussions about sweating the small stuff, accountability, being able to go into a class of any age and say, what is it the children can and can't do? And I'm afraid that means a lot of teachers need to raise their game because their own handwriting in a school scenario, infants and juniors, is often idiosyncratic, not the school handwriting, or starting this lead-in rubbish really early on, which is going to cause hardship for adults and children alone. And we've now even got phonics flashcards with those shapes with the little lead-in join, which has nothing to do with reading and reading print.
Debbie, pause you. You're on a roll. It's brilliant. Brilliant subject. And we just really want to make sure that there's a little bit of time for people to ask any questions, particularly on thinking about spelling. So we've got a question in the chat. Do we know how the criteria for the new round of validation for SSPs differs from the last one?
No, but people were invited to feedback and contribute. And I was part of a group that did that. And in a sense, it's perhaps a little bit more detail put in, because even a poor program can fulfill a core criteria. So if the government is going to continue to validate, they need to have a knowledge and understanding beyond just the core criteria. But I don't know what the final one.
I'm happy to spill the beans on that one, that we are expecting the new criteria for validation to be published on Monday. So not long to wait. Monday should be for that one. Well said. Phonics for everyone at any age just needs to be age appropriate, teach the needs of the learner. Absolutely. And I think sometimes we have a perception with phonics, because it's come from infant programs, that therefore the content and the words might be very infant based. But even though it's the same code, the first time we visit the code, we visit it at an infant level, don't we? And then the next time we visit the code, we can visit the code at an age appropriate level for Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. What are your thoughts? This is a really good question. I get asked this a lot. What are your thoughts regarding a whole word reading approach for pupils with specific learning difficulties, e.g. ASD?
That's such an important question. Sorry, it's the same alphabetic code. And, you know, I've explained there are hundreds and thousands of words in reading material and in our spoken language. Are we saying that we're going to take struggling children through learning those hundreds of words and thousands of words one by one? No, not at all. You need to look at how good is your phonics program or your phonics provision. Because when I go and model lessons to whole classes and to special needs group and don't know the children at all, I invariably shock the staff because they didn't know what those children could do when the activities are really core, content rich and fit for purpose.
I've seen a real shift with that, actually, because speaking from my own experience going in and supporting schools with children with all kinds of special needs, I became convinced that actually for some children with some difficulties, actually they did learn whole words quicker than they were picking up the alphabetic code. And so I actually started to feel that actually we can make exceptions, and yes, perhaps some whole word. And it was you, Debbie, actually, and the experiences that we then went on to have where I learned that actually, gosh, that was a misconception that I had, and that actually by exposing those children properly and more thoroughly and fully and consistently and rigorously, they are able to learn with the phonics code.
Studying those words, you know, there are many words with unusual parts of spelling. We need to flag them up. So if I go into a teacher's classroom, I expect a good plain visual aid board and not junk on it, dedicated to plain font, you know, words flagged up that have arisen in the wider curriculum.
Yeah. Recommendations for phonics programs or approaches for children in Key Stage 2 who haven't grasped the code from infants. So flagging up that we've got Katie Parkinson here, who is the director of Lexinics. Lexinics, that can you provide Lexinic? And then Phonics International, of course, Debbie's work. Yours is all age, you know, any age.
Yes.
Any other ones that you know of that are Key Stage 2 appropriate?
Well, I kind of do, but as a program author, it's really awful for me in that I don't think I should be saying anything.
Yes, of course.
So I'm quite happy to flag up Phonics International because it can start at 4+, but it's designed to be perfectly suitable for older children as and where required, and it's free now, so people can evaluate. What I criticise is when you go to the websites of programs, you don't get a transparent understanding of what it is you're buying into. They might show a few example pages, but I feel in a modern era, they should be more able to give a better idea of what it is before they have to start parting with their money.
Yeah, and then of course, for those of you that don't know, I've got some work that is derived from Debbie's, that's Key Stage 3 workbooks, basically, a teacher handbook, all completely for free down by Abigail's. And again, any further thoughts about children with dyslexia? We know that the phonics code is still extremely important for them and is the primary strategy, but are there any adaptations to provision that you would suggest?
I think that, for a start, dyslexia can be caused or exacerbated by the nature of our teaching. And I still see an awful lot of phonics provision that literally isn't content rich, and it isn't practice rich, and it's not digging deep on paper, lined paper with good pencil grip, which is, the research shows the link between learning the code for reading, even with handwriting. So it's sweating the small stuff with lots of content. Now, Abby and Anne and I did a recent webinar on the maths of the phonics. So if any of you are consultants or teachers, go back to your provision and count literally, what does revision look like? What code is covered? What does each child do? How do you extend your able children so they're not coasting and they've got more meat of an activity and more independence? So there are so many features and elements of provision, and they do vary program to program. So as advisors, and your group, this is an advisory group, it really is about getting to know the differences, the similarities. I never really made the similarities clear. Systematic synthetic phonics, teaching at mainly phoneme level, blending for reading and coding for spelling, and no multi-cueing word guessing strategies. That's what they have in common. And after that, they're different. Can I just say one thing? My email is debbie@phonicsinternational.com. And my Twitter name is @DebbieHep, 2 P's on the Hep. And so if questions arise following this, you know, let's carry on with the questions, and don't be afraid of asking anything, because I'm used to being asked anything. And I reiterate that this is my opinion based on my experience.
Debbie, thank you. I'm sure you've given everybody some food for thought there. Whether people agree with you or they don't agree with you, there is no getting away from the fact that the English language has a code and we need to know it. And you're absolutely right in what you were saying before. In fact, I was scrabbling around looking for words to hold up, but I don't know if it's yours, but the one that I usually use is calceolaria integrifolia.
That was from me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I probably nicked that from you. But I think that is really a good exercise to do, to really show people that although you probably weren't taught using phonics, taught to read, then you use it all the time in terms of syllabification, and there's so many other phonological approaches, even so much as the artificial articulation that we use when we're spelling out February and Wednesday on the board. So I think that's been brilliant. Thank you very much. Is there any last questions that anybody wants to ask or to say? As I said before, this has been recorded and will be available on Debbie's website and the NAAE website. Can you nod at me, Nikki? Yeah, that's okay. I'm just going to pop in the chat box now the forthcoming we've got some forthcoming events with NAAE that some of you may be interested in. I did say before, if you are an advisor or a consultant in any way, you may be interested in having a further look at NAAE, and I'm going to pop those links in there now so you can have a look at them. There's also in there Nikki's email address. Nikki is our secretary, so if there's any questions about NAAE membership, then please get in touch. Anything that anybody wants to, I see Ruth's already beaten me to it there. I've put the link in though, you see, I'm one step ahead. Okay, so if anybody wants to get in touch about anything, I will send you the link after this. I did put a note before about making sure that your name was there. I think you've probably all done that now. Actually, there's somebody there as iPhone, so if you don't mind, you may not want to reveal who you are, but if you can just send me a private message now and tell me who you are, otherwise I don't know who you are to send you a link. Anything else, Debbie or Abby or Nikki or Ruth? Anybody want to say anything?
Can I just say that what I didn't touch upon was, in the same way that we've moved away from, when we teach reading, we're not teaching a range of reading strategies for lifting the words off the page. In a sense, spelling's behind that, because we can sometimes give children a whole plethora of spelling strategies and say, what do you like best? And some of those might be rainbow writing and pyramid writing and things like that, which in effect, they're not research-based, but they undermine the phonics approach. And we need Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 to be knowledgeable teachers to build on the phonics that children have had, not to then give a plethora of other spelling strategies. There's a small case for some mnemonics now and again for some words, but the better you know your phonics, the less you need that. So I think spelling is the next area for development in the UK context. And thank you, actually. Thank you for everybody, willing to give their Saturday morning up. Brilliant.
That's great. Thanks very much, everybody. I hope we'll see you again very soon. There's all sorts of things happening in the next couple of months, and we've got plans for other things as well. So do keep looking at the NAAE website and see what's going on there. But for now, thanks very much and good morning. Hope you have a good rest of the day. The sun's shining here in Lancashire, so I hope it's sunny where you are.
Thank you for hosting, Janet. It was brilliant. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you.